Okay. Oh, I was actually going to promote this too. Hold on. This Saturday at the American Fork Barnes and Noble. Actually several Saturdays in a row. So there are going to be different young writers workshops. He looks like a great author, never read his stuff, don't know. Seemed like a great guy when I met him and he passed me this flyer. They'll be at 11 o'clock at the American Fork Barnes and Noble, and they'll go for about 45 minutes. There's one on May 4th, one on May 11th, and one on May 18th. So literally the next 3 Saturdays. So, if you're interested, feel free to come and look at this flyer again. For those of you who are interested on YouTube, there's the information so you can stare at it real quick. And now let's get started. Alright. So, today we're going to be talking about food, which sounds weird because, you're like, there's plot, there's characters, there's villains, there's anti-heroes. There's way more important stuff than food. However, in my opinion, it's the little details that matter. We've talked about character before, we've talked about anti-heroes before, we've talked about all these big important concepts before, and sometimes it's the little things that matter, especially depending on what you're writing. If you are wanting more lessons on character or things like that, I have those on YouTube, so feel free to look up American Fork Library on YouTube and see more. For those of you who are on YouTube right now, go to that other lesson. But we're going to be talking about the importance of food in writing. Food is actually incredibly important, especially if you're doing a regular fiction novel or a romance novel, because there isn't a whole lot of action. So sometimes people going on a date and eating food, or being at a family dinner and eating food, it's part of life, right? These are things that your character is going to encounter. Or if they're visiting another culture and they're traveling to and on vacation, you try different foods, right? Or if you don't try different foods, we can talk about that too. That is also important. So, first we're going to talk about the what and why of food. This is actually really important to character development and can actually really help you show what kind of person your character is, which sounds weird, but bear with me. I'm going to give an example. What kinds of foods your character likes and doesn't like, and why, can actually really help you learn more about the character. For example, I was editing a book recently, and one of the main characters does not like mint. He hates it. And the reason why is because he was so poor for such a long time, and that he has only really ever known mint toothpaste. And so as a result, he doesn't appreciate the flavor. And sometimes there's not necessarily a why either, too, because there can be very much a just I don't like it for whatever reason. But if you have a reason, some people do have a reason for not liking certain foods, right? I know that there are some of my friends who don't like the texture of certain foods, and so that's why they don't like them. I know that I actually love eating octopus. I think it's delicious, but some people don't like that texture at all and think that's weird and rubbery and not good. So honestly, sometimes there's a reason, but sometimes people are just like, not for me. Doesn't sound good, and that's okay too. But we're going to talk about more what's and whys with food, because there's so much to explore with food and character. For example, do they love food? Some people, food is like their thing, right? They cook, they eat food, and then they cook again, and it doesn't matter how many dishes stack up, they just love food and cooking and the experience of it, right? Then there are other people who don't love cooking, but love food. They will gladly go out to eat every night of the week, but they do not want to wash a single dish or have to deal with cooking. That can happen too. Do they eat out of necessity? Is it kind of like, I really hate green beans, but it's the only thing we have in the pantry? That can also be very telling too, because that tells you, oh, hey, the fact that they're willing to eat something that they hate says that there probably isn't a lot of food in the house, right? That's going to tell you a lot about your character, or rather show you a lot about your character. I should use the proper terminology, considering that's a show technique, not a tell technique. So telling would be like, they don't have a lot of food in the house, so I have to eat these green beans. Whereas showing is like, I really don't want to eat these green beans, but I'll eat them anyway. And then you're wondering why, and they go to the pantry and it's empty. That's why. So that can really be something that shows you a lot about the character. It can also show you the gratitude of the character when they do have really good food, because they normally eat out of necessity. So when they have something that's just really good for the sake of being good, I can only imagine that character would be so grateful and just so happy to not have to just eat something because it's cheap. Are they a picky eater? This can tell you, again, a lot about your character. Funny thing is, a lot of people say that picky eaters are just like picky because they're picky. I took a genetics class. Half of it's genetics. Half of it is being picky, but the other half is genetics. So, as a result, this can tell you a lot about the character if they're a picky eater because they feel they can be picky, versus if they're a picky eater because genetically they just don't like certain foods. There are actually different dispositions in the genetics of taste buds, funnily enough. And so as a result, if you have a mom and a dad who have children and they both don't like cheese, more than likely that not liking cheese gene is actually going to be passed on to their kids. So it's, funnily enough, it can seem like it's just a pickiness thing, but sometimes it's genetics. Anyway, so that's also a fun one to play with. The last thing that I'm going to talk about with this is are different things like, is it part of their culture? Is food part of their culture and how they live? Because very much so, there are different cultures that have all sorts of different kinds of food, all sorts of different reasons for eating different kinds of foods. I know that there was one book that I read in middle school. I cannot remember the title of it for the life of me, but it was really good. And it was all about this Korean girl in a Korean American family, and she hated kimchi. But kimchi is like a staple part of Korean diets. And so her mom was constantly being like, eat the kimchi, and she was like, no. And it was a point of contention for her and her family, actually, that she didn't like kimchi, and yet she was Korean. And so it was kind of funny. But it also told us a lot about the character, the fact that she was willing to be herself in the face of the family. If she just like ate it even though she hated it, that would also tell you more about the relationship with her family, right? Because she felt comfortable telling them, I don't like this food. That generally says you have a better relationship with your family. All right, and last one. This one's kind of a sensitive topic, but it's important to talk about. Do they have any sort of body image issues? Yes, food actually is part of this, even though not everyone struggles with this. A lot of people struggle with this. And this is something that you can include in your novel. You don't have to include it in your novel if you don't want to, but that can very much be a part of your novel because it's a part of reality, unfortunately. It's hard. We live in a culture where it's very much like, look like this and be like this and bleh. It's annoying, it's obnoxious, but as a result, that can affect your relationship with food sometimes. That can cause people to go on extremely restrictive, insane diets and pretend like they like it, even though they absolutely hate it. Is that something your character feels they need to do? If so, why? Talk about that. That can very much help us get to know your character on a deeper level. Or are they just going on a diet because they have to? Is it like they have a heart condition and so they can't eat certain foods because they need to stay low on cholesterol? Or they need to cut out certain things in their diet so they can have other sorts of health problems cleared up. That is also very true of food. Do they, wish that they were healthier, or do they not mind going on a diet? I know there are some people who are like, I'm not dieting because I want to, I'm dieting because it tastes good. Some people just love salads. So as a result, think about if you're going to have restrictions on what kinds of food the person has or is eating, why? And tell us more about that. I would love to get to know your character more through this kind of thing. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is describing food. All right. Now, this is actually very important because food is something that you can use in fantasy and science fiction to really immerse us in this new culture. If you're doing a fantasy world, for instance, having fun fantasy recipes can be really fun. One of my favorite things is in Keeper of the Lost Cities. I can't remember the name of it, but there's this special kind of basically hot cocoa, but they make it out of a very certain thing, and they call it something special. Anyway, Point is, she made her own recipe for it because it sounds so cool. And it's made out of like magical ingredients, obviously, that you can't obtain in the mortal realm, but that's fine. But that tells us a lot about their fantasy culture, right? The fact that they created this, there's this cool thing that you know about now. You can also use this to tell us about your science fiction culture. Star Wars does this a lot, where it'll introduce some sort of like senatorial meeting in the Clone Wars, and they'll all be eating some sort of crazy looking thing on a plate that looks like some sort of, I don't know, bug. And they're eating it delightfully because they're like, this is the cultural food. And that can tell you a lot about it. It can also tell you a lot about their type of world too, if like it's a science fiction post-apocalyptic world and they, they're sitting there eating dragonflies or something like that. That tells you that they probably don't have a lot of food lying around because they're serving up dragonflies, right? So being able to describe those foods using the 5 senses can be really helpful and really fun for the reader too. This is something that actually is used in a lot of Studio Ghibli movies, where they'll have a very cool like food or meal and they'll kind of show it to you in extravagance and have it be all pretty because it's very fun to like hear about new foods and listen about new foods and watch people eat other foods. It's fun. I would just say, don't forget when describing food, it's not just about the taste. Taste is amazing. Taste is fantastic. Yes, taste is the main reason why food tastes good. Haha. But nonetheless, taste also happens to have to do with your other senses too. The sense of smell is going to actually change how things taste because they are connected very heavily. There have been a lot of studies done where someone's like smelling tomato juice and then like eating an apple and they're like, ew, this apple tastes funny, and it's like, no, it's just because you think you're smelling tomatoes. And so that can actually happen where if something smells off, you automatically assume it tastes off. And so your brain just kind of goes, it's bad. Gross. So having a good sense of smell when you're describing food can be nice. The way it looks can also be nice. For example, if it looks like a giant black burnt hunk of meat on a plate, you're probably not going to think it's going to taste as good. Whereas if it has like a nice golden crispy kind of look to it, you might think, oh, that sounds better, right? Or if it looks like a big green slime blob, you're also probably going to go, doesn't sound delicious. So looks and texture can be very influencing when describing food. Sometimes even sound can be very influencing when describing food. If they're eating said food and it tastes good and the texture's good, but then it makes this like bone-shattering crunch, that's going to be a little disturbing, right? That's going to change how you feel about it. All right. Next. All right. Next, we're going to talk about culture / lifestyle. This is going to, once again, tell you a lot about that type of person and help you get to know them better. For example, in a fictional example, I'm going to use mostly real life examples, but in a fictional example, if any of you have watched Avatar: The Last Airbender, the TV series, I don't know about the live action, but the original animated series, they all have different things that they eat, right? The water tribe, primarily fish, seaweed, all those kinds of things, because that's part of where they live, right? They live near the water, and so they're going to be primarily eating those types of things. Whereas with Aang, being an airbender, they don't believe in killing anything, so they're entirely vegetarian. That tells you once again a lot about their lifestyle, the fact that they don't believe in killing anything to the point where they're like, hey, I will stay completely vegetarian and just eat like beans and other things like that, tofu and things like that. It's very interesting, and it compels you to be like, oh, this is kind of immersing us in this world, right? It helps you feel like the world's more real to have these details. Examples of this in real life are like showing the history of people. For example, something being kosher. That's being the Jewish tradition of separating various foods and blessing various foods due to their religion. That is very cool, right? That is very much something that you could include in your own novel, having it be like, oh, well, these certain foods have to be different from these certain foods, or things like that. I would steer clear of doing it the exact same way, just because that could be weird. But if you're like, hey, we only have this type of food, but we don't eat this type of food, these are separate, blah, 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 you could totally do that as part of the culture, and that would be interesting. It can also be very impactful to tell you about the history of said people. For example, Navajo tacos were not originally something the Navajos ate. Navajos had much more rich, complex diets, but you wouldn't know it based on Navajo tacos. And the reason why is because of the fact that it was actually made back when they were being given rations on the reservations, and they had to figure out, what do I do with this? How do I make this taste good? Because these rations are terrible and don't taste good. How do I make them taste good? And that's how Navajo tacos were created. It's a sad and heart-wrenching story, the fact that people being rationed on food created something so beautiful, but it also tells you that they were willing to look at something that was a bad situation and say, how can I make this better? And that makes you go like, wow, I feel influenced by this, right? And you can do the same thing in your novel and say, hey, in the past, in their history, maybe this people was persecuted, and so as a result, they created this type of food to avoid persecution or whatever. Or to communicate with their ancestors, or you can have all sorts of different reasons. Another example of like lifestyle would be Japanese cuisine. Japanese cuisine has a lot of fish, rice, and seaweed, because those are all things that grow there and that would be prevalent on an island, because they live on a big island. And so as a result of that, that became part of their diet, right? Like I said, you generally wouldn't have someone living on an island eating eating something that can only be found in the desert, right? Generally probably not going to happen. So it's important too to look at how you're building your fantasy or science fiction culture and say, hey, are they living in a desert? Do some research on desert cuisine, and you'll find all sorts of fun things that you could do and be like, oh, hey, I'm going to do this thing for my story, and make up all sorts of fun things. Another example of creative cooking techniques that were innovated by history is jerk chicken. The original, I can't remember the full story, but the original story is basically that there were these soldiers who were trying to hide, and in order to hide, I believe it was from pirates, they couldn't have any sort of smoke. And so in order to cook their meat, they were like, how do we cook our meat? Because if we cook it above ground, then it's going to smoke, and they're going to see us, and they're going to find us. And so as a result, that's how they developed the idea of cooking it in a hole in the ground. They made a fire underground, put all this stuff in the hole, and then waited for it to cook on the coals under the ground. So it didn't create any smoke, so they wouldn't get caught, but it also created a very cool cooking technique that we still use today. And it's very awesome, and I love it. I think it's so innovative and cool, and the fact that it was created through this crazy event in history is just amazing. I love the culture of different foods. So there are all sorts of things you can do to help your world seem much more vast and much more real and in-depth. And it can be through food. It can be really fun to do it through food. All right. Okay, next we're going to be talking about love versus contention with food, which, again, sounds weird, but it's honestly true. Food can very much be a sign of love. There are lots of cultures where it's like, the more food I put on your plate, the more I love you. The more that I want to give you, the more I care. There's also a lot of cultures where it's kind of like, finish all the food on your plate or I'll be upset with you. You know, that's also very much a cultural thing. So that can be love and contention. It can also be something that food brings us together for, right? You can be brought together for a meal at a wedding. That's for love, right? You're celebrating love by eating this meal. Oh, is the door still open? Ah, cool. Hold on. We'll have her open it. Anyway, all right. So, but you can also have food be a point of contention. where if someone's, at a family dinner and two of the siblings don't like each other very much, but they're here because the parents said they had to be, then you can very much say, like, this is a point of contention, right? And so that's how food can help illustrate that. Even if you just do it in kind of a funny way, like maybe one of the siblings loves sweet potatoes and they finish all their sweet potatoes and the other sibling hates them, and so they're just kind of poking at them. And the one sibling who finished them is like, see, I finished all my sweet potatoes, I'd like so and so. And it's like, that could cause a fight, right? That could cause some hands to be thrown.
Or when like there's that one older sibling that you don't know as well, but you ate the one half that you like, and he ate the one half that he likes. So you just kind of switch plates and hope mom's not watching.
Exactly. That could also be a sign of love, right? I love you enough to switch foods with you because we both don't like that type of food, and you like the other one. So it'll just boop. Yeah. So there you go. Food can very much be a point of love and unionizing together, or it can be very much like cause problems. So in reality, it's funny because food may seem like something that you may not want to include in your novel. You may just be like, it's food. But you can use it in a lot of different ways to add tension in your novel that doesn't require fists being thrown. I mean, maybe fists will be thrown eventually, but but you can use it to show all sorts of different things with how your character feels, how they interact with their family, what kind of foods they like. You can show their type of, like, their culture. You can show their history. You can show all these beautiful dimensional things through food. You can even show if food helps someone feel better. Some of us around here, myself included, food helps me feel better. And then there are other people who food for them is so hard to obtain, or maybe they're in a really poor country, and so as a result they're, like I said, they're eating to survive, not necessarily because they like it, but because they have to eat it to survive, because that's what they need to move forward. It's honestly, food's a very diversifying topic. You can tell a lot about a character and about a person based on how they handle food. And as a result, I would say please try to use it even just a little bit in your world building. Because not only is it fun for your readers, because then they can imagine what it's like eating in your place. Like, I don't know about you, but anytime I read a fantasy or sci-fi novel, and they're like, and they had this really cool meal, I'm sitting there like, ooh, what would that taste like? Like, trying to imagine that, and like, what would it be like to eat that food and be there with them? It feels it gives a sense of immersion in the reading and in the world that you don't get otherwise. And even if you're writing like historical fiction or regular fiction or a murder mystery, food can still be very interesting and a very unifying topic. Especially if you're doing historical novels, learn about what they ate during that time period. Let me tell you, there's some weird recipes that are in some of those time periods. I was doing some research the other day, and they were like, here's everything that you might eat in the 1920s, and I was looking at some of them like, what? And so there are all sorts of crazy things. There are also all sorts of fun things too that you're just like, why don't we eat that today? That sounds fun, So in general, I would say think about it. Don't necessarily have to include it, but I would say highly consider it, especially because it makes your reader feel much more attached to the novel and much more attached to your work and the culture and the characters that you are creating. All right. Any questions about including food in your novel before I turn the video off? Because today's lesson was only like half an hour. I'll give you a minute to think of questions, and then if not, I'll just turn it off. Yes, question.
What if your novel or whatever is about food? What?
Absolutely. Make sure to include food then. But I would say it depends on what it's about. Like, if it's a cooking show, very much I would say do lots of research on professional cooking techniques. Watch lots of cooking shows. It's absolutely delightful. I watch cooking shows all the time, and it's sometimes really fun, right? You're like, oh my gosh, who's gonna win? If it's about food in that, like, they're learning how to become a chef. Once again, I would say research how to become a chef, what kinds of techniques they use, because that's going to be your audience. People who want to become and learn more about cooking and become chefs and learn more about cooking are going to be your audience. So I would say definitely just make sure you do a lot of research into whatever kind of cooking you're going to be doing, especially if it's going to be a different culture too.
But what if the main characters are food?
Our food.
What would they eat? Because they're food. What would they eat?
That's a great question for you to answer. That is up to your imagination.
It's going to get food from like photosynthesis. So
That
you
is
can
fair.
just
That is
like
fair. If
that.
it's a
Like
salad.
tasty sun.
Tasty
Right?
sunlight. That would be amazing. I need to see a salad. Make a sunlight salad now. But yes, honestly, it's up to your imagination. That's the fun part about this, is the fact that you can imagine whatever the heck you want. If you want to have a culture in your novel that eats bugs, they can eat bugs. If you want to have a culture in your novel that eats sunshine because they're all plants, have them do that. You can have all sorts of things like that. Any other questions before I turn the video off? Okay, I'm going to turn the video off. Oh, and don't forget, quickly before I turn this off, we do have a writing contest going on right now, and the entries are due on May 31st. So you guys still have a little over a month. A month and like 3 days. I would recommend turning it in before the 31st, just because on the day of the 31st, you have to turn it in before 5:45, or else I will not count it. So try to turn it in the day before, so that way you're not rushing in to turn it in.